glad we have these two distinguished commanders here, and we've been very lucky. In spite of this weather, we've got a decent crowd. If the weather held, we would have had a house full. So why don't I welcome both of you to the dais. Please come. So the drill we have today is Admiral will start off, make the first sortie, speak for as long as he wants, followed by Air Chief Marshal Brown, who will sum up. Thank you very much. So.
Thank you, Mohan. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My most profound apologies for this late arrival, but there was absolutely nothing I could do. I'm basically a villager from Goa and never seen this number of cars in my life, and we moved at absolutely snail pace. So thank you for your patience and thank you for staying on. I didn't expect too many people to be still around. Speaking at Guruswamy Center is like bringing coals to Newcastle, because as you must have gathered in the last couple of minutes, whatever I'm going to speak about, Mohan knows much more than I ever will. Not only on this, but many other subjects. He's not only a renowned economist, but he's an authority on many security and other issues. This is a bit of a daunting audience, because if my old CO is here, Air Vice Marshal Parker.
Yeah, he's here.
Yep.
Sir, good evening. And my former Minister of State for Defence. So they are two daunting personalities. Sir, thank you for coming. And Minister, thank you for coming. I'm truly honoured. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the topic that was given to me by Mohan. So I'll try and put across my views, and if there's something that you don't agree with, then we can discuss it later. Now, there's been a view that India, despite its size, economic heft, military strength, and nuclear arsenal, has shown ambivalence in its national security outlook and policies. For decades after independence, this ambivalence manifested itself in the ability of the political elite to reconcile two contradictory sentiments. Sir, anything I say about politicians, please do bear with me. One sentiment was that of hubris, a sense of hubris based on our ancient culture and heritage, which drove India to occupy a high ground and claim an exalted position in the global pecking order. At the same time, there was a minimalist posture which translated into strategic diffidence and self-imposed constraints in policies. Now, in the last few years, we've seen this diffidence being replaced by a degree of assertiveness. But while we welcome this change in attitude, I think we need to pause a little and see how substantive and how deep it is. Now, not only has India fought 5 wars since independence, our internal situation has remained fraught with danger, and today we continue to face a daunting external environment. It is for this reason that, notwithstanding other pressing demands on our financial resources, India has had to devote a huge amount to national defense, and our budget has been around 4th or 5th largest worldwide. So given these circumstances, it's been a cause for great concern that Indian politicians have traditionally shown indifference to national security. This came about because till the general election 2019, politicians did not see security as a vote-catching issue and wanted to devote their time and attention to electioneering and other issues of political survival. I said, do forgive me. A manifestation of this indifference is that for 70 years, India's parliament has never discussed national security with any seriousness, nor has the defense budget ever been discussed in parliament. Now contrast this with the attitude of other statesmen elsewhere. John Adams, second president in 1809, said this. He said, I must study politics and war so that my sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy and other things. 100 years later, this is what David Cameron said. This is the first time they issued a national strategy in the UK. He says, in a world of startling change, the first duty of the government remains the security of our country, and we will report annually to Parliament on national security strategy. And they've kept their word. So, against this backdrop, let me just take you quickly through our recent history so that you can judge for yourselves how effective India has been in upholding our national interests. October 47, Pakistani forces invade Kashmir. Our nascent young political and military leadership undertakes, I don't think they undertook an overarching analysis of what was going to happen and gave no strategic direction to the forces other than saying repulse the invaders. So after a year of sporadic fighting, just as the Indian army was getting the upper hand, Nehru referred the issue to the United Nations, and the so-called Kashmir issue has festered for the last 70 years, and it's been draining us in many ways. China, at the end of the Civil War, had a clear vision of where they were going. They wanted to dominate Asia. They wanted to be a nuclear power, a world power. They had that vision. But we deluded ourselves with hopes of Sino-Indian camaraderie and sought to appease China by acknowledging its suzerainty over Tibet. Poor political and military judgment led to a military confrontation with the PLA overrunning our positions, and this debacle, while demonstrating our naivete, also exposed how out of touch our ruling elite was with the realities of life. Our finest hour came in 1971. We won a great victory over Pakistan, liberation of Bangladesh, etc. Then Mrs. Gandhi, next in 72, convened the similar agreement, and as a victor on the negotiating table, we virtually gave away all the gains of the war, including POWs, territory, etc. in return for promises that Bhutto made, which he had no intention of keeping. The point to note is that Mrs. Gandhi did not deem it fit to take any military advisor with her to Simla. In the strategic domain, India agonized for 24 long years after its first nuclear explosion, and then went nuclear, only to have Pakistan promptly catch up with us. As India's nuclear weapon, missile and now missile defense programs unfold, it's becoming more and more obvious that they are guided exclusively by scientists, while the scientific community and the armed forces have been kept at arm's length. Pakistan's nuclear program, under the close supervision of its military, it's controlled by the military most uniquely in the world. They've switched from uranium to plutonium, and the warhead pile of Pakistan is supposedly larger than ours. But this switch from uranium to plutonium means that they've got smaller warheads. They can put them on tactical missiles. And while we continue with our no first use, at least so far, Pakistan could well be contemplating something known as flexible response. So we need to think about this. So finally, events like the Kargil War, the 2001 military mobilization, 1.5 million soldiers were mobilized, the 26/11 Mumbai attacks and the Doklam standoff have all posed dilemmas for our statesmen against the background of a nuclear two nuclear powers confronting each other. But I'm not quite sure whether we've got to act right, whether we learn the right lessons, we know how to handle such a situation. So against this general, very broad background, let me deal with the neighborhood, starting with China. Now, given its economic and military strength, its revisionist outlook and past record, China can be expected to push its influence in the region, grab territory, rewrite rule. In fact, Chinese diplomats and strategists openly say that the time will come when we rewrite the rules. Now, which rules they are going to rewrite, we can imagine ourselves. But the rules will be to suit China. Manifestation of China's belligerence is a campaign of cartographic expansion. They mounted through the 9-dash line to start with, our own McMahon line, which they've completely disregard. And of course, when Philippines went to the World Court, the verdict was completely disregarded by China. So these are all indications of how China is going to behave itself in the future. Now, while China's dominant military position in Tibet poses a severe challenge to India from landwards, the establishment of maritime footholds in the Indian Ocean, including a base which they've created in Djibouti and another one which they'll have in Gwadar, are meant to provide a network of port facilities which could support long-range maritime operations when the time comes. So as we contemplate these developments, we must remember that China's grand strategy aims to we tend to look inwards at the Indian Ocean and around us, but China's vision is much broader. They want to reshape the geopolitical fundamentals of global power, and they take their lessons from Mackinder on land and from Mahan at sea. So as you will see from this slide, China dominates the Eurasian world island. World island was a term used by Mackinder. On one hand, the 15,000 kilometer economic belt connecting central China to Europe is creating a transcontinental infrastructure for the economic integration of the world island. Chinese goods travel within 6 or 7 days to Europe. High-speed railways, fiber optic cables, energy pipelines, and so on. At the same time, an ambitious maritime Silk Road, which involves 65 countries, an expenditure of trillions, promises to transform the economy and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific. Now, China designated the maritime domain as an essential building block of the China dream. Xi Jinping spelled it out clearly to the Central Committee. This was about a decade and a half ago. Since then, China has become a true maritime power, unlike us. We claim to be one, but we really are far from it. Chinese shipyards, China owns the largest number of merchant ships in the world. 5,000 merchant ships is the biggest merchant fleet worldwide. Their coast guard is number one in the world. Their fishing fleet and its ocean-going fishing fleet, it's a huge fleet. Nobody else has one like that. Chinese shipyards are rapidly adding to its fleet of modern destroyers, frigates, submarines, aircraft carriers. They've just built an aircraft carrier in 3 years. We've been trying to build one for 15 years. We are not yet anywhere near closure. Nuclear submarines, so on. In a few years' time, not too many years, the PLA Navy will be as large as the US Navy in numbers, if not in capability. Coming to Russia next, the Soviet Union has been a steadfast friend, source of political and diplomatic support, military hardware. 65% of our hardware still comes from there. As a successor state, Russia continues to enjoy considerable degree of support, but things have changed. Indo-Russian relations have, post the disintegration of USSR, they've become far more transactional. There's no longer that good feeling between our two countries. India, in an effort to diversify its sources of weapons, have gone to Israel, France, and USA, and Russia obviously resents this. But in spite of these tensions, India will continue to depend heavily on Russia, not only for supporting our legacy old system, but also for acquiring new systems like the S-400 interceptor missiles, and we're going to build about 200 or 300, come out to 26 helicopters. Putin is a prime practitioner of realpolitik, and he struck a virtual alliance with China because of the sanctions from Europe and US, pressure from USA. In Russia's new orientation, Pakistan as China's iron brother is increasingly seen by Moscow not just as a weapon client but also as a useful counterpoise to India. So if India acts too difficult, then they'll say, okay, we'll sell arms to Pakistan. So these are issues of concern to us. The recent visit of Mr. Modi to Russia and the inking of various deals, especially India's heavy investment in the Russian Far East. We've issued a line of credit of $1 billion. That has possibly reassured Russia a bit, and it's a reversion to our traditional policy of strategic autonomy in which we tread equally between the two. We may also see Russia playing a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific, strengthening ties with countries like Vietnam, with Indonesia, India, and the Pacific Fleet showing itself more and more in our waters. Pakistan could take a whole evening, but I'll just say a few words about it. Pakistan's internal affairs and foreign policy, as you all know, are guided by the deep state, which consists of the General Headquarters and the ISI, the Intelligence Directorate. And the Prime Minister, the current one, owes his office as well as his continued survival to the deep state. Now they've maintained this bogey of the existential threat from India, fictitious, but it keeps them going. It convinces the Pakistani people that the army is indispensable for keeping Pakistan together. While facing acute internal discord on account of deep unrest among Balochis, Sindhis, and Pashtun ethnic minorities, Pakistan has continued to export terrorism and interfere in the internal affairs of both India on one side and Afghanistan on the other side. China and Pak, as you know, have formed a very menacing anti-India nexus, and by bolstering Pakistan's tottering economy via the CPEC and arming it with nuclear and conventional weapons, China hopes to checkmate India and confine India to a South Asia box. All our aspirations of becoming a regional power or a great power will be held in check as long as Pakistan keeps nagging us. A substantial induction of Chinese naval hardware into the Pak Navy is due shortly, including we suspect nuclear armed missiles on their ships or possibly on their submarines. This will be a game changer as far as our security is concerned. Combined with the operationalization of the Gwadar naval base, this will have a significant impact on the balance of maritime power in the Indo-Pacific. The abrogation of Article 370 obviously has caught Pakistan unawares. It is desperately trying to revive what it calls the unfinished agenda of partition and seeking international focus on Kashmir. How far it succeeds, I think we don't have to worry too much about it. The USA, now at some point in the last decade, the USA decided that China is not going to go as they had thought China would. They encourage China to come out of its shell, join the world order, but China's behavior has not been as the USA hoped. So now they feel threatened by China, and they thought they needed help to bolster their declining influence and power in this part of the world. And a consensus obviously emerged in Washington that India would be a useful ally to have in this part of the world. On India's part, of course, the Indo-US nuclear deal, etc., are all part of the same logic. On India's part, for us to attain our full economic and strategic potential, we will need a period of stability and some insurance against hegemony, mainly from China or the China-Pak nexus. This respite also has to be used by India to modernize its armed forces and acquire advanced technology for the defense industrial complex. There are few choices before us, and a partnership with the US would appear to be a pragmatic option at this juncture. Successive Indian Prime Ministers have declared that the two nations are natural allies, and I think Mr. Modi is just taking forward that logic with his Howdy Modi and all that, and it seems to be going well. On the ground, apart from India signing 3 or 4 of those foundational agreements which have pleased America no end, very little has come from America in substantive terms. No technology has come. We've invested about $20 billion in American hardware, but in spite of that, Mr. Trump still holds the dagger of this CATSA, countering America's adversary through sanctions, that if we buy the Russian S-400 system, they will impose sanctions on it. Now, the uncomfortable question facing Indian policymakers is this, that given Trump's unpredictability, is banking on Washington a good idea? We've already had a taste of their unpredictability, and now with Trump withdrawing from what is called strategic altruism, which they used to show towards India, towards Delhi so far. So we have to tread very carefully on this. Now, although we want a stronger relationship with Washington, partly because Modi has already expended much capital on this cause, but India has already started diversifying its international portfolio and trying to repair relations with Beijing and with Moscow. In June 2018, Modi himself used a major international address to revive the concept of strategic autonomy, which I just mentioned, so that we can have good relations both with USA, we can have good relations with USA without alienating Beijing or Moscow. So this was very briefly a survey of the external environment, and I'm sure Mohan can give you a much more brilliant survey, but this is what I thought should preface what I'm going to say next. Now, let's take a look at some worrisome issues which are related internally to our security. The run-up to the 2019, sorry, I missed this slide. The run-up to the 2019 election appeared to herald the dawn of a radical change. The Pulwama terrorist strike and its sequel saw a major shift of political focus, with national security issues being accorded importance. Now, at the beginning I had said that we've suffered from political neglect of national security, but this seemed to have changed. Post-election analysis showed that the ordinary voter had indeed noted and applauded the government's resolve, as demonstrated by the September 2016 cross-border raids and the February 2019 airstrikes by our Air Force across the border. The NDA government's emphasis on national security was thus seen as a major factor contributing to its re-election with a massive majority. Now that politics has resumed its normal tempo, elections are behind us, not really another 2 states are going to election, but we're coming to a more normal situation. I think that we need to see whether the focus on national security actually signified a strategic transformation which could propel the evolution of structured security doctrines and strategies, or is it merely a populist and transient tactical measure? So against this backdrop, I'm going to highlight 5 issues which in my opinion pose grave challenges and if ignored could cause serious harm to national security and well-being of our nation. First and foremost is, sorry I'm missing out on the slide. First and foremost I think should be domestic peace and harmony. India's army chief has frequently declared his readiness to face a 2.5 front war. The 2 fronts obviously are China and Pakistan. And as I've just mentioned, China and Pakistan have formed a nexus and they pose a formidable threat to our security. It's the half front that I want to mention. That signifies an even greater peril which is inherent in India's multiple internal fissures, religious, sectarian, linguistic and caste base. Some of these have already erupted into violent conflagrations, while others await a spark. Amongst India's current internal security threats, which include insurgencies in the northeast and violent Naxalite movements across 14 states which seem to have dropped below the horizon, I would pinpoint Kashmir as the most serious. One hopes that the abrogation of Article 370 and changes in the status of erstwhile J&K state will bring peace and help foster integration as well as economic development. However, if we are going to debunk the Jinnah's two-nation theory and convince the Muslim majority of the Union Territory of J&K that they made the right choice in 1947, I think we need to reflect carefully on a number of issues. One, whether the pursuit of majoritarianism of any kind, linguistic, religious, whatever, is a good idea for a multi-religious, multi-ethnic and multilingual country like ours. Two, will engendering insecurity amongst any section of our people enhance our security or undermine it? And three, should maintenance of domestic harmony and preservation of the nation's internal cohesion not be made a key national security objective? Only if we have internal harmony and peace and tranquility will the Indian Army be able to face external enemies without having to worry about the half front behind us. The next issue that I want to talk about is India's higher defense organization. Two post-election developments that have served to refocus attention on badly neglected areas of national security are: one, the elevation of the National Security Advisor to cabinet rank and the Prime Minister's announcement about constitution of a Chief of Defence Staff on 15th August. In April 2018, the appointment of NSA was to head the newly constituted Defence Planning Committee with a wide-ranging charter had already created uncertainty about the status of the service chiefs. Where do they stand now if the NSA is going to head the DPC? And also of the MOD, of the Raksha Mantri and so on. Where are they in the chain of command? His post-election upgradation to cabinet rank raises larger questions about the roles likely to be assigned to the Chief of Defence Staff as and when, or if and when he comes. Then where does the Chief of Defence Staff fit? And what will be the nature of reforms which we are contemplating for our higher defence if the National Security Advisor is going to be a Minister of Security in truth? So to provide a clearer picture, I need to delve a little bit into history for your benefit. In 1947, during the transition from Imperial Higher Defence Organization to one which was better suited to us, the military suffered two major setbacks. which had long-term deleterious consequences which we face even today. The first one was an act of commission whereby the three armed forces headquarters, instead of being merged with the Ministry of Defence, made into departments or whatever, or ministries by themselves, were made into attached offices of the Department of Defence. Ministry of Defence had 4 departments, and one of the departments is Department of Defence, and under that department other 3 service headquarters. So this has put the armed forces in a subaltern position. The chiefs, notionally, the Defence Secretary is the boss, and they have to go through him to the Raksha Mantri. In fact, not in theory. This was followed by an equally damaged act of commission, the failure of the new Indian state to accord recognition to its armed forces. The IAS and IPS, to be joined later by the Indian Forest Service, have been created as All India Services by Article 312 of the Constitution of India. They are named there, that they are required. The functions, responsibilities and status of the armed forces, the chiefs, the operational commanders, the PSOs, finds no mention anywhere, not in the Constitution, not in the rules of business, etc. So the absence of recognition and lack of defined status has worked to the detriment of India's military in many ways. The service chiefs receive perfunctory attention from politicians and bureaucrats because they have no locus standi. If the rules of business say the Defence Secretary is responsible for defence, so the chiefs, they are listened to with politeness, etc., but they don't really count at this moment. In other democracies, the military head, whether he is Chief of Defence Staff, Chief of Joint Staff, is not only part of the government, but has direct and regular access to the head of government. In India, it could take weeks, even months, for a chief to get to see the Prime Minister. The Chiefs of Staff Committee was conceived as a key organ which would render advice to the government on matters relating to defence and security. It is presided over currently by one of the 3 chiefs, the senior most of the 3 chiefs. Unfortunately, it's a rotational position. The senior most chief is put there. When he retires, the next senior most takes over. The tenure may be 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year. It is not known. So this erodes from the gravitas of the Chairman Chiefs of Defence Staff, from the Chairman Chiefs of Staff Committee. He is also in the nuclear chain of command. The Prime Minister, perhaps the NSA, whose position has not been defined, but then it is the Chairman Chiefs of Staff Committee who's in the nuclear command chain. But in this system with a rotational part-time chairman, it is really not a serious kind of post. So it erodes the credibility of our nuclear command and control and dilutes the push for jointness, which is supposed to be one of the functions of the Chief of Command. Now, expert bodies have been constituted both by the UPA and the NDA governments. And these, the first one was a group of ministers in 1999, in which Mr. Arun Singh was there. Then the next government convened the Naresh Chandra Committee, and both these bodies pointed out glaring flaws in the current organization and recommended urgent defence reforms. And most vital of these reforms was the recommendation that we should have a Chief of Defence Staff. Now, in the past 2 decades, both the UPA and the NDA have ruled the country for 10 years each, but neither of them has so far thought it appropriate to implement any of the substantive recommendations, especially CDS, till Prime Minister Modi announced it in last month in August 15. Okay. So what are the national security reforms that we need to look at in general terms? This year, the allocation of budget to MOD amounts to $62 billion. As I said, it's the 3rd or 4th largest in the world. But this is only 2% of the GDP. And of course, the military complains bitterly about the government's parsimony. But given the current state of the economy, this is a large chunk. It's about 16% of central government expenditure. And I don't think a poor country like us can afford to give any more money to the armed forces. Of greater concern is the fact that a full 60% of this amount will be spent on the pay and pensions of 14 lakh soldiers, 4 lakh civilians, and 31 lakh retired personnel, including most of us sitting in this room. The realization, so this leaves after pay and pensions, it leaves very little for buying new hardware or what we say modernization of the armed forces. The realization that the most expensive item in the defense budget is not hardware, it is the man. You pay the man while he's serving. When he retires, you pay his pension. When he dies, you pay his widow, and so on. So it's a huge expenditure which we don't seem to realize. China has grasped this reality much long ago, and through a steady process of downsizing, right sizing, radical reform, they've cut down the size of their armed forces and they've replaced manpower with firepower. National security reforms in India therefore must be viewed against the background of 7 decades of political prevarication, bureaucratic resistance and military ambivalence. So it is for this reason that Mr. Modi's dramatic announcement about CDS received a widespread welcome. But let's remember this is only an announcement yet. The devil is in the detail. It all depends on, if it is taken up in earnest, this is going to be a transformational change. So a lot depends on what is the charter given to the Chief of Defence Staff. What are the other changes which are contemplated to be brought about. I believe there's a committee being formed for this and we should know soon enough. But we need directives, we need doctrines, we need policy changes. Just saying here is the Chief of Defence Staff will be quite meaningless. Now there is not enough time to discuss the details, but if a Chief of Defence Staff is to be brought in, then it should involve a whole ecosystem, the change of the whole ecosystem. So as I said, I can't go into detail, but we could talk about it. Let me move on to the third security challenge, which is of significance, and that is civil-military relations. Now, there's no better reminder of a soldier's place in the scheme of things than Clausewitz's dictum. He said that war does not have its own logic and purpose. The soldier must always be subordinate to the statesman. The conduct of war is the responsibility of the latter. The war will be fought by the Prime Minister and hopefully by the Defence Minister, and the chiefs will do as they are directed by the political leadership of the country. Now, so therefore control of the military demands knowledge of strategic and military affairs and involves tremendous responsibility. It also places heavy demands on the time of the minister assigned the defence portfolio. Successive defence ministers have found it convenient to delegate this responsibility to the civilian bureaucracy in the incorrect belief that civilian control of the military can be exercised on their behalf by bureaucrats, which is not fair, not correct, quite inappropriate. India's bureaucracy takes pride in being generalists who can switch from state to centre and from ministry to ministry with equal facility. But national security is a discipline that requires continuity as well as deep expertise to deal with issues of immense complexity. In our current system, civil service postings to the MOD are short and often they are stopgap arrangements to better things which they aspire to. They do not permit the individual to acquire knowledge and experience required to deal with intricate issues of military hardware, force architecture, infrastructure, personnel management of the armed forces are all unique issues and they need in-depth understanding. Also, by refusing collegiate consultation with the armed forces, the ministry sits separately, the armed forces sit separately. If the armed forces want to talk to the ministry, we have to do it on a file which goes to the ministry. The ministry makes a copy of the file and sends the original back. We don't know what goes on in the ministry. Mr. Raju, of course, knows everything. So by refusing collegiate consultation with the armed forces, the bureaucracy has denied itself the benefits of professional expertise, and this is one of the reasons why we have delays of 5 years, of 10 years, of 20 years in acquisition of little pieces of hardware. A jet trainer for the Indian Air Force took 25 years, during which time we lost about 200 young pilots through accidents. The fourth area of serious and the last area of serious concern is India's failure to attain self-reliance in production of weapon systems. Now we have a vast defense industrial complex comprising thousands of talented scientists, network of DRDO laboratories backed by advanced production facilities of 40 ordnance factories. They are on strike at the moment. And whole lot of public sector under the massive. BEL is a huge, HAL is huge. They can compete with any similar organization worldwide. Over the years, they have assembled thousands of imported aircraft, aero engines, tanks, missiles, and other items. Amongst the major achievements of Indian scientists, we can count nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, fighter aircraft. Tejas is flying with the Air Force, and of course, our nuclear submarines. We must not belittle these achievements. And yet, when it comes to self-reliance, India is the world's second largest importer of arms and remains abjectly dependent on unreliable foreign sources. Today they will sell you something, tomorrow they'll refuse to sell you a spare part, and a tiny little screw or nut can ground an aircraft. Successive governments, by failing to provide a grand strategic vision and a roadmap for India's massive defence industrial complex, have scripted its precipitous decline. We have policies for various energy, for heavy industry, for space, etc. But there has been no policy for defence industrial capability for the last 72 years. Inattentive defence ministers have failed to infuse innovation, dynamism and efficiency in defence PSUs and neglected to plan their future growth. Most decision makers fail to realize that India's claim to rising power status will remain hollow unless it acquires the capability to design and undertake serial production of major weapon systems. One hears talk about the Tejas being rejected or being closed down. The Kaveri jet, turbojet engine is lying there for 30 years, not making any progress. There is again talk of shutting it down. We can shut down these projects, but then let's remember that for the next 500 years, we will always be importing all these things from elsewhere, pouring our money into foreign coffers. One of the causes of this failure is the total autonomy which has been granted to the DRDO, which enables scientists to set their own priorities, often at the expense of soldiers' urgent needs. DRDO is pursuing a hypersonic vehicle. A few months ago, there was news that we are importing 8.5 lakh rifles and carbines from Czechoslovakia or Hungary. So there is obviously a gap. On one hand, we got hypersonic vehicles. On the other hand, our soldiers don't have rifles. Since the military has no say and the bureaucracy lacks the expertise to intervene in DRDO's affairs, scientists are not held accountable for the time or cost overruns. Similarly, the vast public sector defence production complex under the supervision of the Ministry of Defence has disappointed by undertaking assembly and license production when we actually expected indigenization. Had the military a little bit of greater say in what goes on, perhaps things may have been different. So that brings me to the end of my talk. Let us recall that for years, Indians have yearned for resolute leadership which could clearly define India's national interests, visualize concrete goals and articulate a national strategy for their attainment. In the past 2 decades, as I just mentioned, both the NDA and the UPA have ruled the country for 10 years each, but none of this has happened. We don't have a national security strategy, we don't have a doctrine, we haven't had any reforms, we don't have a CDS. We are now in the first few months of a new government which has ridden back into power with an overwhelming majority and a resolute leadership. Can we then expect a military transformation from this government, starting with national security reforms? Such reforms, the world over, are wrought by visionary and enlightened politicians, almost always in the face of fierce opposition from the military. Don't expect the military to cooperate in reforming itself. In the UK, they had ministers like Duncan Sand, Michael Heseltine, John Nott, etc. They are still revered and celebrated for the reforms they managed to force through. They've created an integrated MOD, they've made their armed forces join. In the USA, it was again 2 politicians, Goldwater and Nichols, who slogged for years and fought bitter battles and pushed through the Goldwater-Nichols reform. So dare we hope that a bold and visionary political initiative will come forth in India and the new government will bite the bullet, implementing reforms that our national security desperately needs. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience, which I have taxed excessively. So once again, my apologies for this late appearance.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Notwithstanding the weather that we've had this evening, I'm extremely delighted to be here to share some thoughts on a very crucial subject, which actually is one of our favorite subjects when we talk of national security. And who else to listen to but our Admiral Arun Prakash, who I'm greatly admired while in service, and also his crusade to reform our system for national security. And he's been a prolific writer and a very articulate speaker. And as you saw this evening, in spite of being at 12 knots, he's finished in good time. Well done, sir. Well, as I see it, especially in Asia, there appears to be a great power game change which is going on at this point of time. And the focus appears to be in Afghanistan itself. And if you see Afghanistan's history, what stays in Kabul doesn't stay in Afghanistan. It spills over into the neighborhood. And with some of the recent events, and I won't go into all those details, which also involves at some point of time, if it, God forbid, if it spills over into Jammu and Kashmir, and as what the Admiral said about a major security concern, and that is of a big worry to all of us when we talk of national security. At the same time, we are aware of the corrosive, from our point of view at least, and the collusive nature of the relationship between Pakistan and China, and Admiral Arun Prakash has covered in a fair amount of detail on the neighborhood itself and what challenges it poses to India in the short and the long term. And they export the jihadi terrorism onto us, notwithstanding the cyber and the space challenges, the internal security challenges that we face. But at the same time, if you look at it, have we been asking the right questions? I'm talking about as common citizens and not specifically people from the armed forces. Because why is that India has been so accident prone? If you look at our history, and he's recounted all the events that have been going on since 1947, and especially in the realm of defense and security issues. And you took the example of the 62 conflict, the 71 ops, where we lost it all in the negotiating table. Then we had the Kargil fiasco. I call it a fiasco still, because though many people claim it to be a victory, but I still feel that it was very high cost. The IC-814 hijacking, followed by the parliament attacks and the mobilization, all which went to actually naught at the end of the day. And then of course we had the Mumbai 26/11 attacks, 166 people killed, including 26 foreign civilians. And thereafter we had the series of strikes across the LOC. You talk of Uri, you talk of Pathankot, and the latest, of course, was the Pulwama attack. So all this leads us to believe that how is it that we've been getting it so wrong right from the days that we got our independence. And there is a lack of apathy for the subject in the common public domain. I only get to see or read or hear people from the armed forces talking about this. Why is it that the common citizen doesn't question these issues? And this apathy actually is, I'm very proud of, at least from Mohan's side, that you organized this lecture for us on this talk, so that at least we can focus on something which is so missing in our public discourse. And everybody that only talks about, that you read, is the CDS, is it good for India? Is the CDS bad for India? What will he do? As if CDS is going to be like Hanuman, who just arrives and solves all our national security problems. That's not going to be a fix, at least in our scenario with all these complexities that we talked about. There's also a fact that why we don't discuss it is because apparently there's a lack of strategic culture in our system. I'm sure Admiral Prakash is aware of George Tanham and the Rand Corporation report, which I think appeared sometime in the mid-90s, which spoke about the lack of strategic culture in the Indian mindset. And when I was listening to this talk, I was just thinking that instead of this 120 people sitting here, wouldn't it have been nice to have 1,500 people sitting in Delhi listening to this talk in a very nice auditorium, perhaps in a national defense university, which India doesn't have. And right from the Kargil time, we've been talking about having this Hindu university, which will be the fountainhead for all strategic thought, and it will promote this kind of dialogue taking place not only in the armed forces but also amongst the civil population as well. And as Chairman Chiefs of Staff, I recall that we had done a fair amount of work progressing this case forward for the Hindu university to come up. We got through all the bureaucratic hurdles of who should head it, and we had a very knowledgeable, the NSA then, Shankar Menon, and he pushed it through, and that's 7 years ago. But yet that university has still not come up. We got the land in Binola. Also, we had the foundation stone laying ceremony in May 2013. But what I've heard recently, and please don't quote me, is that the bill is going up and down between the cabinet and the ministry. That is the latest on the Hindu university. And why there was some stalemate on that Hindu was because the word Hindu is no longer politically correct. So that N has been removed and now it is IDU, the Indian Defence University. Like I said, please don't quote me on that part as yet. Well, so this lack of this lack of coherence is because we have not had a defense and a security policy. As Admiral Arun Prakash mentioned, that there is no document, there is no paper on what our national security interests are, what our strategy is going to be. The only document that I have seen in my service time has been the Raksha Mantri's operational directive, which is incidentally is drafted by the Chairman Chiefs of Staff himself, which goes to the ministry with some corrections, and it comes down at the, that's all that we have. And I get a sense that why it is so is because the whole issue is kept a little blurred. Because once you put things down as a document, that establishes the gold standard, and people will be held accountable to that document once it is put down in black and white. But like so many other countries, unless you have a clear path ahead of you, how do you guide your people who may have some different ideas? And there's nothing like putting things down in black and white to at least move our cases forward. And then of course the whole heap of issues related to the civil-military relations, the lack of integration between the service headquarters and the ministries, the time spent in moving things up and down. And that's resulted in a kind of a dysfunctional way of functioning between the armed forces and the ministries and the government itself. And that results in what the question that I asked you right in front. That has been the series of accidents that we've had, the Indian state has had in dealing with national security itself. At least that is what my analysis is. And while some of you may think that this is all theoretical, actually it has a very important practical end result. And I'll tell you how it happens. And I'll tell you two stories here, which may be of some interest to you all. Because we tend to think that the generalist bureaucrat, he may be a very good person, but that is the environment, the ecosystem in which he functions. Why do delays take place? Why do cases take 4 to 5 years or maybe more? And I'll give you two small stories about the Balakot strikes that we just did. The first one, of course, is the fact that on 26th, when the Indian Air Force did the strikes, following that, the DG ISPR, the Pakistani side, went ballistic as to deny anything had happened. The world media took it up. The New York Times, the Guardian, and everybody else said, look, these guys have hit it all over the countryside. And the ministry itself and the Air Force constrained to talk about it publicly, which they're not supposed to. So the impression that everybody gathered around the world globally is that did these guys actually hit? And I'm sure many of you may have had the same doubts itself. That of the 5 bombs that we hit, there were at least 4 to which I'm aware of did the actual strike. Now the story that I'm going to tell you takes you back to 26/11, because following 26/11, the Prime Minister then was very concerned as to our capability to go and do this kind of precision strikes. And that time I was a deputy chief, and a little later when I became the chief, during that period, we had worked a lot to get specific weapons which would actually do this kind of damage. Precision strikes, fire and forget weapons. And we narrowed it down to the Spice 2000, which was used eventually in the Balakot strikes. The contract was signed in April 2012. And a year or two later, we had operationalized it on the Mirage 2000. So that was the weapon actually we used for the strike. But my story doesn't end here. A year or two later, we had asked the government to give us the same weapon, but with a different warhead. The first warhead was the penetration warhead, which goes inside and explodes, kills everybody there. The other one was the HE warhead, which was to flatten out any structure which was available there. And this case went back and forth for the next 4 to 5 years. The question that kept asking the headquarters was, why do you require a different weapon? No, we said the same weapon, different warhead. No, that means you have to start the new case all over again. You have to do trials all over again. You have to do the flow to tender all over again. If that weapon had been available to the IAF on 26 January, we would have used a mix of both. Not only would we'd have killed all those jihadis which were there, not a single brick would have been left standing in that structure. And 2 days back, the army chief, in fact, has said that Balakot is operational again. I'm sure you must have seen that on the news. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the impact that these kind of issues have on our national security. And I'll give you the same event, another story. When Abhinandan was shot down, he had crossed the LOC in the chase, in spite of the fact that the controller was telling him that, he's crossing the line of control at high speeds. Now in the MiG-21, as it is, when you go at 1,000 kilometers, it makes a lot of noise in the cockpit. Plus there was also radio jamming. In 2011, we had started a case for software-defined radios. I don't know, sir, if you may recall some of these issues when you were in the ministry. Now these were stalled because HAL said they will make the SDR. The SDR is a very sophisticated piece of kit. Eventually, when we floated the RFP, everything else was happening. Bell said, no, we will make it. Since you mentioned PSUs, I must mention this here. And out of 110 SQRs, Bell failed in 95 of these. But they kept delaying it. They said, no, we'll do it. Eventually, we dropped Bell and we went in for the imported version. That imported version will perhaps come out in the next few months. If that SDRs had been available to Abhinandan in his cockpit, he would have heard everything very clearly. And I'm so happy that he's still around us. It could have very well be the other way around. So this is the end result of a flawed security apparatus and what ails us. And the third, of course, is the minister himself is fully au fait with the 126 MMRCA case on the Rafale case, where we were supposed to get 126 aircraft for the Air Force. And this case went on for a number of years. 90% of the work was over. Trials, everything was over, everything was selected. Now it was just a question of negotiations. And the negotiations are at the last end of any procurement cycle, and which actually is the easiest part. It's almost done. But because nobody in the government took ownership of this project, we found that the IF was the only one holding this baby, and the baby just slipped out of our hands. Why I'm relating it to national security was that if we had signed the contract in 2012-13 for this 126 aircraft, 2017, 4 years later, we would have had 2 operational squadrons. And if that had happened, Doklam would never had happened, never should have taken place by the Chinese. Because the foreign governments and foreign powers are very aware of our capabilities much more than actually what we do. And I say it again, it's my understanding that if we had had those 2 squadrons by 2017, Doklam would not have actually taken place. The Admiral spoke about the elections where we have a new government, and our hopes and aspirations are for at least for not only reforming the system, but for making some major changes to the setup of the apparatus that we have. Now, my understanding is that war actually could be defined as an armed conflict between political communities. It's like violence between two political communities. But here we find that the political communities are within their own country. How else do you explain that in an election campaign that you pick on, maybe I'm being politically incorrect to say this, but how can you pick on a campaign on just one issue, and that at the end of it all, when the elections get over, nobody is talking about that issue anymore because everything is kosher now, and all those major strategic analysts who came out with all those facts and figures, who appeared on TV every day in, day out for next 1 year, they've all gone back into the woodwork. Not a single word is anything, so everything is absolutely perfect. So my question is that if you do not have an agreement between political parties on an important matter of national security and what is our interest, how can we then ask somebody else who's external to us not to do this here or not to do that there? We have to have a common platform within the country itself, maybe in a closed door session between the political parties, so that at least we are on the same wicket when we deal with these issues. I'm only concerned about the man in the cockpit, because when he straps into one of the Rafale aircraft, he should not be worried that, whether there's something which went on behind the scenes which he's not aware of, or which he's flying maybe a second-rate or a third-rate platform. So our parties have to get their act together, irrespective of who's in power, to at least arrive at this common point. The defense reforms that the Admiral spoke about are all very welcome, but I think what is important is not personalities. We need to have that process functioning from step 1 to step 15, because unless you have the processes working, then you'll have a certain checks and balances in the system as the options get thrown up, to which the national leadership can then take a note of. While both our conversation may perhaps sound a little depressing, but I just wish to talk also of 2-3 positive, a very good positive sense that the India has done in the last couple of years. One, of course, is the fact that we went nuclear in '98, and a 1-2-3 agreement with the US was one of the major strategic shifts and major high mark in our, if one is to record Indian history, maybe 100 years hence. The other thing, of course, was the Balakot strikes and the Article 370. Because we don't want to get into too many details of the strikes itself. I've already given you that much. But just think about it. On 5th August, when you did 370 abrogation, if Balakot had not taken place, just for a moment, think about it. If nothing had been done, and we did Article 370, I can assure you that in the next 10 days, we would have had a jihadi strike in India or in J&K. That tells you what our deterrent posture has resulted in to the other side. And though the Pak army is the one which is under tremendous pressure now to do something, because they are now answerable to the public, because they certainly find that they're the ones who've been so upset by the abrogation of this article, that we very well may have something. I hope not. But that is a connection that we've had, that we have crossed the Rubicon when we did the Balakot strikes, and that is not the first or the last step. You may have to do many, many more with varying degrees of quality and intent, and hopefully we'll have all those things that we had asked for then would be available to us in the next round itself. The 370 part, we're not going to discuss it here, but I think one major strategic shift that has happened is that it has allowed India now to de-link our territorial issues with China separately, because that also deals with the areas which have been given by Pakistan to the Chinese side, and deal with Pakistan separately on the J&K issue. Well, there won't be any progress, I can assure you, on the J&K issue with Pakistan, because it happens to be an ideological issue. But at least as far as the Chinese are concerned, when we deal with the border talks, then at least we have that option of dealing with just the boundary and the territorial issue with the Chinese. So that has actually effectively de-linked the Pakistan and the China triangle, the triangle that we have, that's going to face us now. So with these few words, I would like to once again thank Admiral Lawrence Prakash for this wonderful analysis. And please join me in giving him a very good hand of appreciation.